This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 53 of Here's How. The UK government has announced that they will be triggering Article 50 within the next 2 months. But do they have a coherent plan? Do they have a plan at all? Let's hear from a leading Brexit supporter.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
I'm closing down the something for nothing society.
This is Peter Lilley. He was the minister responsible for social welfare in Margaret Thatcher and John Major's cabinets.
Tougher rules affecting so-called New Age travellers. Most people were as sickened as I was by the sight of these spongers descending like locusts, demanding benefits with menaces. We are not in the business...
This speech is at the 1992 Conservative Party conference.
I've got a little list of benefit offenders who I'll soon be rooting out and who never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's those who make up bogus claims in half a dozen names and councillors who draw the dole to run left-wing campaigns.
He remained an MP after Tony Blair came to power, and he supported the Leave campaign in last year's Brexit vote.
They never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's young ladies who get pregnant just to jump the housing queue, and dads who won't support the kids of the ladies they have kissed. And I haven't even mentioned all those sponging socialists. I've got them on my list, and there's none of them be missed. There's none of them be missed.
The Here's How podcast is back for 2017, and my first guest will be talking about the implications of Brexit for the UK and for Ireland.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
Peter Lilley is the MP for Hitchin and Harpenden in the UK Parliament. He was a cabinet minister for 7 years under Margaret Thatcher and John Major. He left the cabinet in 1997 and he's been an MP ever since. And he was a vocal supporter of the Leave side in the UK Brexit referendum. Peter, how is Brexit going for you?
It's going well, I think. The Prime Minister's speech this week was very well received both here and abroad. It was more explicit, more clear-cut, and very positive than people had expected. And that ended a lot of uncertainty and gave a very clear sense of direction to which people in business and industry have responded well.
Faisal Islam, the Sky News reporter, reported a source on the morning of the vote, a Leave source, saying there is no plan.
He told me this. He said, I said to him, so where's the plan? Can we see the Brexit plan now? There is no plan. The Leave campaign don't have a post-Brexit plan. And he was pointing over there to where the Vote Leave HQ was. And then he pointed over there and he said, number 10 should have had a plan. Now, it sounds like I'm making that up. That literally happened 2 hours
Was that true then? Is it true now?
I don't think it was true then. Of course, the Leave campaign were not the government. The government were on the other side. The Leave campaign, therefore, didn't were in a position to make promises specifically as to what we would do once we regained powers over our laws, our money and our borders and our trade. Now the government has accepted the decision of the British people. They are able to flesh out all the sort of things they will do once we've got those powers back. And also the particular things they'll rule out in the course of any negotiations with the EU.
Would you accept that there's a lot of uncertainty? Nobody really knows what's going to happen, and that can be damaging.
Yes, we've got a bit of a clearer idea now because of what the Prime Minister said, but clearly until the negotiations are complete, no one will know for sure the arrangements that we'll have for trading with and cooperating with the rest of Europe after the end of 2 years, and that's why I would like to see the process shortened if possible.
Okay. Commentators in Ireland, including Micheál Martin, the leader of Fianna Fáil, have made comments to the effect that you haven't a clue what you're doing. And just one issue, for example, your parliamentary colleague, the UK Farms Minister George Eustace, he said in a speech at the Farmers Club in Westminster that, and I quote, "We think we can get back the devolved powers for farming." That's to say, to move powers that the Scottish and Northern Irish and Welsh assemblies have over farming, move that back to Westminster. How do you think that'll play in Holyrood?
I don't think that's what he said. He said that the powers that have essentially been transferred to Brussels will come back. And at present they're handled at Brussels, even though farming as an issue theoretically is a devolved responsibility. Mm-hmm. But he was making the point, I didn't actually hear that speech, but other ministers, including the Prime Minister, have made the point that it will be important that we have a single market for the United Kingdom in agricultural products and so on. And so when these powers come back from Brussels to the UK, they will be operated in a way that ensures we have a single market for agriculture and don't have sort of borders between England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Sure, but you can see it's a bit of a sticky wicket because as it stands, all agriculture powers that the UK have are devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. They're going to say, well, if Brussels is giving up these powers, as happens with Brexit, they should be staying with us in the devolved parliaments. And it sounds like something that the SNP, it's a stick that they could beat Westminster with and say that they're essentially losing out on what's rightfully theirs.
Well, they'll try making that, but it sounds a bit rich when they do, because they don't want these powers back. They've been saying that we shouldn't leave. We should leave these powers in Brussels. So for them to suddenly say, actually, we really did want them back, and we want them so desperately they've got to be operated at Holyrood or Belfast or Cardiff and not in whatever way the United Kingdom decides will ensure a single market. And that may involve some delegation of powers to the devolved regions. But as long as we continue to have a single market, an internal market in agricultural products.
But you take the point that this wasn't something that was fleshed out before the referendum. It does seem like something that's being made up as it goes along. And
no, I don't take that point at all, actually. Thank you very much. That's the sort of thing that was bandied around during the referendum campaign. The referendum campaign's over, and there's not much point in refighting the referendum campaign now. We fought the referendum campaign to get powers back. During the referendum campaign, those who were campaigning to remain speculated in all sorts of terrible ways those powers might be used if we got them back. The British people said, no, actually we'll be in charge and we use those powers in a sensible way. And that's why we voted to leave.
One of the issues that's certain to come up is, especially of interest to people on both sides of the border in Ireland, is the border in Ireland. It's 500 kilometres long. It goes through boreens and mountains. It crosses people's farms and their front gardens. In some cases, it goes between their living rooms and their bedrooms. Are we going to have a hard border?
I hope not. I very much not. We certainly won't as far as free movement of people is concerned. We've had free movement of people ever since the 1920s, and we will continue to after we've left. People say, but you want to take back control of your borders for the purposes of immigration. That's true, but the control will not be exercised at the border. We have already visa-free travel with 56 countries throughout the world. And I'm absolutely certain that Ireland will continue with visa-free travel. The way we will control people coming to work in the United Kingdom will be at the workplace. Anyone working will have to have a national insurance number, and the employer will have to ensure that is so. And so it's when you apply for a national insurance number that if you're not a British resident and have right to live in the UK, that's where the controls will be exercised.
Sure. Is that any
There's
different?
a lot of misunderstandings that it. Pardon?
Is that any different to the situation now?
Well, that's not only different from the situation for non-EU residents, but non-EU citizens. But at present, EU citizens can just automatically get a national insurance number. In future, if they want to work in the UK, they will have to be subject to the same terms and conditions as people from the rest of the world, I hope, who want national insurance numbers and want the right to work. Okay,
and do you foresee any problem with perhaps a farmer who wants to sell a few cattle to his neighbour who happens to be on the other side of the border?
Well, I used to be the Minister for Customs and Excise, and we had problems then at the border because of different VAT rates. And if you remember, there was what was called the carousel for fraudulent activity where cattle were driven across the border and got one rate and then back and so on and so forth. We've had to tackle that sort of problem in the past, and we may have to tackle that sort of problem in the future if the EU insists on imposing tariffs on our goods, because then we would naturally reciprocate and impose the same tariffs on their goods. And that would create issues on the border, but issues we've dealt with before, and I hope with the cooperation of the Irish government we will minimise. We don't want to create a fuss for farmers or anyone like that. What we want to stop is people if we've got a 10% tax as the EU currently has on car imports, we don't want to see Germany just simply routing all its car imports in via the Irish border. We can easily stop that without creating great problems for Irish farmers.
Okay, talking about merry great problems, David Davis is your Minister for Exiting the European Union, which is an interesting title. But looking back at some tweets that he sent just in the days after the referendum, and this is a direct quote from his Twitter account, he said, "The first calling point of the UK's negotiator immediately after Brexit will not be Brussels, it will be Berlin to strike a deal. Post-Brexit, a UK-German deal would include free access for their cars and industrial goods in exchange for a deal on everything else. Similar deals would be reached with other key EU nations," and he goes on to talk about France exporting wine with a special deal and Italy for fashion, getting a deal for Italy and its fashion products. That's nonsense on stilts, isn't it?
No.
He's entirely wrong to suggest that the UK could do individual deals with individual EU countries.
They wouldn't be individual deals, but
he couldn't do a deal with
Germany.
Germany.
Hang on. If you want me to answer your questions,
go ahead.
Levy. We wouldn't actually do a specifically different deal with Germany than with France. But what he was saying is that Germany has a great interest in exporting cars. We will want to sort of leverage that. A fifth of all German cars come to the United Kingdom. 1 million German car workers, people in the car industry, are dependent on their jobs on the British market. We will say, please, Germany, if you want that to continue, make sure that you put your weight behind a free trade deal. Go to France and say, your wine comes in duty-free to the present. Do you really want to see tariffs imposed on that at precisely the time we will be able to negotiate free trade agreements with Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, reducing the tariffs on their wine? And thereby, as it were, mobilizing the support of the industries which export to our market in those countries to get their governments to support the idea of a free trade agreement and put pressure on the Commission, which is less enthusiastic, to get such an agreement.
So that's a reasonable thing to do, but he specifically made a comment about making individual deals with individual EU countries. That's impossible.
If you're saying he was tweeting, I mean, tweets are notoriously shorthand, and I shouldn't try to sort of prove he said something silly. He's not a silly man. He may use shorthand when using tweets, as people do, but what he said was perfectly sensible.
The
thrust of what he said was perfectly sensible.
I'll put a link for the readers, for the listeners to read the tweets themselves so they can make up their own minds. But you accept that EU law makes it absolutely impossible for the UK to make individual deals with individual countries?
Individual trade deals, correct. You can, however, reach an agreement.
Yes,
you can reach an agreement with the government that they will support a deal.
Which would be EU-wide.
Of course it would be EU-wide, yes.
Okay. You have said, and one reason that I wanted to talk to you specifically is because I think you've been frank when perhaps other people have not been quite so frank in saying that it is possible that when the UK leaves the EU, it could revert to purely what's called WTO. WTO is the World Trade Organization. It could revert to just WTO trading rules. But given the 2-year clock on negotiations, would you accept that there's an element of the UK jumping off the cliff and negotiating the price of the parachute as they're sailing down?
I don't understand that analogy.
But
you are correct. You are correct. I think it is quite conceivable, very conceivable, that the European Union may refuse a trade deal with us if their prime interest is the economic well-being of their people of Ireland, Germany, France, and so on. They will negotiate a free trade deal because it's in both our interests, and it's specifically in their interests because Britain is the largest single market for the rest of Europe, and particularly the largest single market for Ireland. And therefore, if their primary interest is the economic well-being of their people, they'll negotiate a free trade deal. However, if they put a political criterion above that, namely that they must deter other people from following our example, they will refuse a trade deal, in which case we will trade on most favoured nation terms under the World Trade Organization rules.
I want to get to the WTO in a moment, but you said that there were essentially two motivators. One was perhaps punishing, as you put it, the UK. The other was just economic self-interest. There is a third possibility, and I think perhaps some UK politicians might be deaf to it, and the essentially the important point of it is WhatsApp and maybe also Facebook. That there are many people, especially from Eastern Europe, who live in the UK, and emigrating these days is not the same as emigrating 20 or 30 years ago. They're in daily contact with their friends, colleagues, sometimes boyfriends, girlfriends, and so forth. And particularly Conservative MPs have a habit of saying things that can sound quite hostile to EU immigrants within the UK.
For example, what?
I'm not going to go into specific examples. Although
you haven't got examples. Don't make blanket accusations. I know of none of my colleagues who've said anything hostile about Eastern Europeans. I and all my colleagues on the Leave side have been very clear. We want to give an assurance as soon as possible, and I personally would do so unilaterally, and many of my colleagues would agree, to all European citizens who are here at present in the UK, exercising the right to work under the EU treaties, that their position will be protected once we leave. We'll have different rules for people who come in future, but we want them, and I've heard no negative comments from my colleagues about them.
Okay, I think probably...
And you haven't been able to give any examples.
It's true, I didn't research them, but I'll see if I can get some for the notes of this podcast. But I think you're being quite astute in saying that that guarantee should be given unilaterally, but your Prime Minister hasn't done that and has quite markedly said that there's kind of some sort of trade-off between the people working from perhaps Eastern Europe in the UK and the, for example, large number of British residents of Spain and France. I think you have a holiday home yourself in France. And that, can you see how that would rankle with people and perhaps create an atmosphere whereby politicians, Eastern European politicians in particular, who would be more than happy to cut you a good deal, might come under political pressure at home to say, we're feeling negative vibes from the UK, we don't want our politicians to be so generous to them?
On the contrary, as I said, I would be happy to do it unilaterally, and I've expressed that view. But Theresa May has said she wants to see similar assurances given for British citizens. But she invited the European Council, all the leaders of governments, to give those mutual assurances to each other that we're not going to expel EU citizens from Britain and that EU countries are not going to expel British citizens from the EU. Mm-hmm. We all know that no one country is going to expel hundreds of thousands of people. It would be a wicked thing to do, and we wouldn't retaliate even if they expel British people. But nonetheless, it would be a good thing if we could have that early assurance. Mm-hmm. Most of the countries of Europe, I understand, wanted to give that assurance, including Eastern European countries. Mrs. Merkel said, no, we must stick rigidly to the doctrine, which comes from nowhere, it's not in any treaty, that there can be no negotiation before Article 50 is triggered, and then everything must be negotiated before anything can be agreed.
Yeah, do you think
it is sad that that attitude has been taken, and that the humane and sensible approach has been vetoed by the German government, and other governments have supinely accepted it.
I actually agree with you. I think that you're entirely correct on that. But do you think that once Article 50 is triggered, there will be French elections relatively soon, and then I think German elections come after that? Do you think that Angela Merkel might be washing her hair on quite a few nights and will run out the clock on negotiations to put pressure on the UK?
She may, if they don't negotiate in good faith. That will be. I don't see what the elections have got to do with that. But,
well, it's an excuse to delay the negotiations.
Yes, well, maybe. And I think that we should read very carefully Article 50 and invoke the terms of Article 50. And Article 50 says, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with the departing state within the framework of its future relationship. Mm-hmm. Now, you can only negotiate everything else within that framework. Therefore, we must know that framework to start off with, at least an outline. We must know, is it going to be a free trade agreement, or is it going to be most favoured nation tariffs?
Mm-hmm. That means WTO.
Are they going to have no barrows? But yeah, well, that's what WTO means, most favoured nation tariffs. And we just need to know that at the beginning. And if they refuse that at the beginning, if we refuse to respond to that question, which is implicit in Article 50, then it'll be hard to say that they're negotiating in good faith. The issue will come up in their elections. They will suddenly find that 1 million German car workers are saying, what? You're refusing to promise a free trade agreement to the Brits? That means that our cars will suffer tariffs. The wine growers in France, all the producers of luxury goods in France that come to the UK will start being worried. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important that we get these issues up front, out in public, before the election, so that the democratic process is brought to bear in Europe, and their governments don't conspire to do something which their public would not like.
Mm-hmm. You were elected, as you had been elected many times before. You were elected in 2015. And you were elected on the election manifesto of David Cameron, and George Osborne was the UK finance minister after that election. And he promised to fulfil an election manifesto commitment, which was to eliminate the UK government's deficit by 2020. Is the government pursuing that?
No.
Why not?
Because it said following the Brexit decision, the changing the exchange rate, the uncertainty that it involved, it would be better to have flexibility than to stick to that target. That was what Philip Hammond announced in the autumn statement.
Philip Hammond is now Theresa May, the new Prime Minister's finance minister. I want to look a little bit, just to conclude, at the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. It's not something that hits the headlines, certainly not in Ireland very often, but it's essentially the agreement under which every country that isn't in the EU or isn't in NAFTA or isn't in some other agreement, it's kind of the baseline. You have said, and I think you've been very upfront, that if all else fails, you're happy for the UK to trade with the EU under the WTO. Do you think that would happen easily? Would that be something easy to achieve?
Well, that achieves itself. If there's no agreement, that's what happens. We would trade under World Trade Organization rules on most favored nation terms with the rest of the EU, as we do already with America. Canada,
that's with quite low
Japan,
tariffs, yeah?
Russia. The average tariff with the EU is 4%, about 4%.
I think you made the point in the House of Commons that, 4%, it's not a zero, it's not tariff-free, but it's less, for example, than an exporter might expect currency to fluctuate by. So it's not an enormous deal. But
and we've seen a 15% improvement in our competitiveness because of the exchange rate movement.
Which means
over the
sterling
last year.
dropped by 15%. Yes,
exactly.
And so a 4% tariff or whatever is absorbed and then some by that.
For most people.
Okay.
But that's an average, of course. For some it's higher, for some it's lower.
Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, you might be more expert on this than me, but as I understand it, as well as being part of the WTO in its part of the EU, the UK is a member of the WTO in its own right.
That's correct. We pay our sub every year of about £5 million.
Sounds like a bargain. But as well as the tariffs, there are lots of other non-tariff agreements, and there's what's called a schedule. And although the UK is a member of the WTO in its own right, it operates under the EU schedule. And one example that I found was, for example, New Zealand exports a lot of sheep meat, mutton, and they're allowed 230,000 tons of sheep exported to the EU each year without tariff, and then after that there's a tariff. Other countries don't get that. Can you see how that gets a bit sticky if New Zealand says, hang on a second, we don't want our quota divided up very rigidly? That means there's negotiation to be done about the non-tariff aspects of the WTO, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, that's called a tariff quota. As it so happens, the New Zealanders only export 3/4 of the maximum they're allowed to export at present. So it ought to be able to both, there's leeway already. But there are other commodities where that isn't the case, and where we will have to reach an agreement with the countries who have such tariff quotas, i.e. quotas that they're allowed to import at a low tariff. That should be quite easy in general. Because we're not a protectionist country. We're not going to be wanting to impose severe limits on them. It may be more difficult for the EU, because the EU, if it's got an agreement to allow in 250,000 tons, has to seek permission to change that, even if we've left. So they would still have to import that same total, even though most of it was actually coming to the UK.
Well, they would have to accept it if it was exported, but
or until they change an agreement.
Sure. But it is the case, as I understand it, that the schedule, that's to say the list of all these exceptions and the precise way trade runs from each country to each country, and there's 160 members, so that's an awful lot of bilateral relationships. You need unanimous agreement to set the schedule for future trade deals with the UK within the WTO?
No. What happens is you post your schedule, and our schedule initially would be exactly the same as the schedules of the EU. So we'll post the same quotas, the same tariffs. And then other countries can object to that and lodge an objection. Their objection, it's not like in the EU where you say, they haven't obeyed the rules. That's not enough. You have to show, A, that the schedule doesn't obey the rules, and B, that it harms you, the objecting country.
So somebody like Brazil, for example, could say, hang on, we want to export to the UK on more favourable levels in the way that New Zealand does, and we're going to hold up this agreement.
No, they could only if the change they could show had harmed them. If we had, for example, not given them any quota.
Nevertheless,
I'm sure it wouldn't be the case. But if we'd done something like that, they could then complain. It would go to a dispute resolution procedure within the WTO, which might take a couple of years. But meanwhile, trade would go on.
There's ample opportunity.
There's sometimes a suggestion that until 160 countries have agreed that schedule, no trade takes place.
Okay, so what you're saying is...
So
is
everybody
that it goes
trades on that schedule. Only those who can claim that they've been damaged by the schedule, which will be quite hard because, except in the case of these tariff quotas, it will be exactly the same tariff as was operating previously. And we will probably be quite generous as far as the tariff quotas are concerned. It will be the remaining EU that will face the criticisms if they try and reduce their quotas to allow for our departure. They may be then subject to complaints from Brazil or wherever.
Nevertheless, there is an opportunity for somebody who wants to make trouble, and people can let things go through very easily on the nod, or they can object to every dot and comma.
Oh, indeed. I mean, at any one moment there'll be quite a number of these complaints going on, as there are present people complaining about the EU's external tariff and arrangements, and they have to be resolved. Mm-hmm. That's what the WTO is for. It's for trying to ensure that disputes are resolved, that we don't have tariff wars, that people can't discriminate against different countries on political grounds, and that the maximum tariffs, the most favored, everybody gets the most favored nation tariff, or they have a free trade deal and they have no tariffs.
Roberto Azevedo, the WTO Director General, said he expected talks to be long and difficult, and he said, we haven't had any discussions about the process. We don't know what the process would be. We do know it would be a very unusual situation. Do you think...
He said that during the referendum campaign, when most leaders of most international non-elected organisations were wheeled out by the British government to say unhelpful things. Since then, he's effectively resiled from that and said that he will do all in his power to expedite the process and make sure it happens smoothly and amicably. And he seems to be extremely cooperative.
Taking everything in the round, do you think that the UK will be better off economically for being out of the EU?
Yes, it will. We've now had figures from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the independent body that prepares forecasts of the government's expenditure before it prepares a budget. And that's calculated that when we leave, the net saving to the British taxpayer from our contribution to the EU will be £13 billion. That's £250 million a week. Not the gross figure of 350 million, £250 million a week. So every week we delay a deal costs us £250 million.
So if that's the case, Peter Lilley, why then abandon George Osborne and David Cameron's commitment to eliminate the deficit by 2020 if you're going to be swimming in money?
Well, it's not swimming in money. £13 billion is not the biggest sum we've ever thought of, because our deficit is far larger than that. But it will help reduce the deficit, and that's a good thing. But
the deficit was planned to go to zero by 2020. Surely you should be able to do that even sooner.
Well, maybe you're right.
Peter Lilley, the British Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, thank you very much for talking to me.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Peter Lilley sort of caught me out there when I couldn't come up with an example off the top of my head of anything hostile said by his party colleagues about immigrants. I thought that was so obvious I missed it in my research. It doesn't take more than a few seconds on Google to find many examples of this, so I'll link to a list, but just to give 3 examples. All sources for this are in the show notes on the webpage, along with sources for other things I was talking about during the interview. And for example, and I'm just choosing things here from senior Conservative Party MPs, Amber Rudd, the UK Home Secretary, was criticised by her own brother. He said that she was denigrating British workers when she published what she called plans to name and shame employers who employed immigrants. Liam Fox, the Minister for International Trade, said, "People who come to the country and consume the wealth of the country without ever having created anything are a different kettle of fish. I think it's about getting control of migration." And former UK Prime Minister David Cameron condemned Labour Party figures for meeting what he called a bunch of migrants, and he described refugees as a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean. That's almost the end of episode 53 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 27th of January 2017. If you can think of a topic that should be covered in the next show, or you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating, or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook. Please follow the podcast on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Peter Lilley at Lilley Peter. And you can subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. If you don't know how to do any of that, there's full instructions, recommendations for podcast software, and contact details for the show, all at www.hereshow.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.